So thank you very much for joining today. So good morning to you in North America, good afternoon in Scotland. My name is Martin Pobrick. I'm the Institute Director of the Asia Scotland Institute. Our focus today is a presentation and a discussion with Michael Goedhuis regarding Chinese ink artists and their value. And if I could just tell you a little bit about Michael, I think many of you probably know him already, and some of you are joining from his network. Michael was born in Holland. I think you can tell from his name, obviously. He was then corrupted by the English by attending Eton College. So Michael, I'm not sure if you're Dutch or English or British, but there are convenient times to be both, obviously. He then studied at European universities in France and Germany before completing his MBA at INSEAD in Fontainebleau. He trained as an economist, became an investment banker with First Boston Corporation in New York and London, and subsequently took a degree in art history at the Courtauld in London. He then joined Jacob Rothschild, working at the Rothschild art investment companies. And by 1992, Michael had established his own company dealing in Islamic and Chinese works of art. And also, I think intriguingly, wrote for The Economist on art in the art world. I would be interested to know if you're still writing for them, Michael. His career in the art world since then has been based on a policy of identifying commercially neglected areas which are of investment potential and therefore appropriate for market development, which is largely what we'll be talking about with Michael today. Michael began to concentrate on Chinese modern and contemporary art in the 1990s and was the first dealer in the West to enter this field with a series of exhibitions, including that at Sotheby's in 2001, China Without Borders, Chinese Contemporary Art. Most of his work since then has been directed at describing both the resurgence of cultural activity in the China of today and the key relevance of Chinese ink art to contemporary aesthetics. On that note, could I hand over to Roddy in Connecticut to talk us through the event? Roddy.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. I'm absolutely delighted and thrilled to welcome Michael Goedhuis to this talk today. We've known each other for a considerable amount of time, and he is undoubtedly one of the world's leading experts on the subject that he's going to address. Perhaps to position this, one of the important ways in which we think we can extend and expand people's understanding of Asian countries is by focusing, as we do from time to time, on the culture of those countries. Indeed, anybody expecting to travel to or do business with such countries needs to have a good understanding of their culture. And so in that respect, Michael talking today about ink works on paper in China is hugely relevant to what we do. Asking you how you got involved with the ink works on paper particularly, and then we can get started with some other questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Roddy, so much, and thank you for getting up so early over there in the States. My whole career in the art world has been one of trying to identify the so-called emerging markets, areas of the art market which have not been exposed to either academic and intellectual interest or commercial interest. And as you know, I've been dealt in Persian and Islamic and Mughal India and Japan, and eventually dealt for some years in antiquities, Chinese antiquities. And it was through my interest in China historically that I became interested in Chinese modern and contemporary culture. And ink painting, of course, is traditionally is the foundation stone of Chinese history and culture via calligraphy, which is the fundamental concept and of Chinese development in society. And so contemporary ink painting became very interesting to me because I felt that it was the contemporary expression of Chinese culture and history. And I started working in that area in the very early 1990s. Went on to develop an interest in Chinese contemporary avant-garde, which was not necessarily works on paper and ink, but other works and oil. So that's really the background to my interest in ink painting, and it continues today because I think it's the most adventurous and interesting and imaginative area of Chinese contemporary avant-garde.
Michael, thank you. In many respects, the works that you talk about are commentaries on things that have happened in the past, things that are happening now, and things that may happen in the future. So the subjects and the artists are often quite, how can I put it? They're subject to critical acclaim, but also to criticism from the government in China. And so there's an element of protest art in here. Could you talk about that?
Yes, the fact is that the government in China throughout most of this period, from the 1980s, late 1980s through to recently, until about 2 or 3 years ago, was relatively lax actually in terms of its control of what was happening in the contemporary world. And unless it was a direct attack, a direct assault on the government or on Mao, it was really not aggressively controlled. In the last 2 or 3 years, Xi Jinping, I think, and the government in general has become more active in suppressing certain manifestations of Chinese contemporary culture. So it's a bit of it's become more of an issue now than it was. Now the ink artists are divided into various areas. You've got the more classical category. You've got on the one hand, you've got the avant-garde, the very aggressive avant-garde on the other end of the parameter. And then you've got in between calligraphy, Chinese calligraphers trying to convert classical Chinese calligraphy into works which are pertinent and meaningful to today. And then you've got a sort of composite style as a fourth category, which is combining classical Chinese painting and calligraphy with the avant-garde. And it's worth saying that I believe that there's a real cultural revolution happening in China today, and it started really in the 90s, and it covers it's right across the board. It's from film to theater to architecture to philosophy to poetry to literature to dance, and of course to art. And so it's a terribly exciting period, I believe, in Chinese history, cultural history. It's worth also remembering, that China is the only empire, the only civilization that has come back in the world onto the world stage. It hasn't happened with Mesopotamia, it hasn't happened with Egypt or Greece or Rome or Byzantium or the Ottoman Empire or even the British Empire. None of these great civilizations have ever come back onto the world stage. China is doing just that, big time. And at the same time, you've got this wonderful efflorescence, fruition, ripening of Chinese culture. And it comes from, I believe, first of all, the freedoms that now exist in China after Mao, but it also comes out of a growing self-confidence, an awareness in China amongst artists and writers and dancers and filmmakers of China's relevance in the world today. And it's my belief, this may be rhetorical, it may be an exaggeration, but it's my belief that China is emerging to be the dominant reality for the rest of time. And so ink painting, for me, has been a way, Chinese contemporary art in general, but ink painting in particular, has been a way for me to understand, as a conduit, to understand both what is going on today in China, on the one hand, but also how it's linked into Chinese history on the other hand. And what I think is so interesting is that Chinese contemporary ink artists are looking back, just as Picasso and Braque and Kandinsky and Cézanne looked back and studied the old masters, the Western old masters like Poussin and Raphael and Michelangelo and Velázquez and Rembrandt, in order to create their pictorial language, their new language, their revolutionary language in the first 10 years of the 20th century. So Chinese ink artists, in order to create their new language, pertinent and meaningful for today's world in China, have been studying the old masters, the Chinese old masters. So you've got by looking at the Chinese ink artists today in all their various different manifestations, you get a direct access to this great Chinese history.
Michael, thank you. We're going to talk about the performance and the value of these works compared to what goes on in the financial markets. But I'm anxious to you have a chance to show us some of the works that you're referring to. Could I just ask you the question about how the almost phenomenal holding up of value of these works has outpaced in many ways what we've seen in the equity and the bond markets?
Yep, Roddy, I think it's difficult for me to compare. It's very difficult for analysts to compare rates of appreciation or depreciation between the stock markets and bond market on one hand and art on the other, because there's simply not enough sustained data in the art market to make it easy to analyze the various differences between them. However, it's my experience that that art, authentic art, if it's of high quality, of any culture, it tends to increase in value over time. With China, I think it's a very different matter. A few years ago, I was invited to manage a very major investment by a large fund manager in America, a $300 million investment into various different areas of the art market. It creates a stable of different investments in art. And we've negotiated for a year and a half on this, and it was potentially very, very interesting for me. However, I didn't see any area of the art market which had a combination of protection on the downside and substantial appreciation on the upside, except for China. And this is not to say that money can't be made and prices don't go up in many areas, whether it's pre-Columbian art from Mexico or old master paintings in the West or Islamic art, etc. Of course, there's an upside and prices are increasing in many of these areas. But the fundamentals in China were so very different to everywhere else. One big factor was the fact that the Chinese elite in the past, the people who ran the country, the bureaucracy in China, the scholar gentlemen, had to go through, in order to be able to run the country, to get to the top, had to go through very, very rigorous examinations, as you know. And these included poetry, history, calligraphy, etc., music, painting, etc. So the people running the country in China, the elite in China, was the most cultivated, educated elite of any country ever in history. And so that is the legacy that is still part and parcel of society in China today. And calligraphy is a fundamental part of it. And so for the Chinese, art and culture is a big deal. And what we're seeing now is Chinese buying at unprecedented levels, trying to buy back the heritage of China. I'm now talking about antiquities and antiques at any price from the West. So much of that material, of course, left China during the late 19th century when the colonial powers were taking things out of China. And so on the one hand, you've got that happening. On the other hand, you've got an interest amongst the nouveau riche, the new emerging young people in China, who are interested in contemporary art, which tends to be what young people are interested in, rather than antiquities these days and antiques. And these people are looking towards work which are attracted to work which in some way embodies their growing self-confidence and pride in China's great history. And that is exactly what exists in ink painting.
That's really interesting, Michael. Now, I think you were going to show us some works as well during this talk, I believe.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me the avenue to do that. Andrew, well, why don't we can have a look first at the works of so-called classical or the classical area, where you've got people where they look, many of these paintings look as if they that look rather similar to works that were painted at the peak of the Chinese culture, the Song period, the 12th and 13th century, 11th, 12th, 13th century. And here you have, for example, a painting which looks like a mountainscape of the past, except that it's been distorted and changed in such a way as to drive a wedge between the past and the present and make it more accessible to the tastes and orientation of young people today and society today. And Andrew, we can go on. That this is Li Shubai. Here's the Liu Dan. This is again Liu Dan, one of the great artists of the contemporary world, who is in this instance is showing us a rock painting, a scholar's rock, which again is very much part of the concept of the scholar's rock, very much part of the scholar elite, the mandarins, the scholar gentlemen of the past who used to have these rocks on their desks and enjoy the connection with the mysteries of nature, which was very important for them. And beautifully painted with, of course, a whole panel of calligraphy on the poetic calligraphy on the right-hand side of the painting, beautiful calligraphy, and he also, Liu Dan, is an authority on calligraphy and a great calligrapher, classical calligrapher. And then we can move on, Andrew, to the next one. And this is Yang Yangping, a famous, she's now in her 80s, somebody who was became very famous in the late 1970s in China, just as things were opening up after Mao died, and was the first artist in China really to be identified by Western scholars and collectors, and who went to China in the very early 1980s and discovered her. And she's been extremely popular ever since. She's now been acquired by many museums in the West. And here again, you have a link with the past, the lotus subject and the brush painting, the colors of the past. But again, it's moved into a more abstract rhythm in order to appeal again to a more modern sensibility. And then we have another one coming up, Andrew, which is another example of something which is, here again, you have a classical artist, somebody who's absorbed great lessons from the past, from the great artists of the past, of the Song period, the Ming period in the 16th century. And again, passionately interested in calligraphy, which you see, it's rather difficult to see in this small image, but calligraphy on the left-hand side, and then again, a sort of landscape on the right-hand side. So again, referring back to the past, but transforming it into something which is much more modern and contemporary. So these are just four examples. And here's another one. So this is 5 examples of, again, of a so-called classical artist, but again, converting classical painting, Chinese classical painting, into something which resonates with the modern sensibility. And then you have, we can go further and have a look at some other images. We could take here's another one, sorry, we've got quite a lot of these from this. And here's another example of actually a beautiful example of an artist we just done an exhibition for, Guanji, who again relates to Chinese Song period painting, 11th, 12th century painting, these great paintings which are now in Taipei, in the National Museum in Taipei, that taken out of China before Mao came into power in 1949. So here you have these classical artists who are trying to transform classical Chinese painting into something which is relevant and pertinent and meaningful for today's society in China. And then you have the avant-garde, the more aggressive avant-garde. But again, here you see it's so interesting, Chu Jie, who is going back to calligraphy. Calligraphy was the foundation stone of Chinese civilization. It was used by emperors and poets and monks and aesthetes and scholars. It's all over China, all these thousands of years, in temples and tea houses, in railway stations now, in hotels, in village walls and doors, all over China. It's a unifying unit which brings the country together. and is appreciated not only because it contains words and refers to the great literary tradition of China, but it also appeals to people who are illiterate because of its beauty. And here you have again Yang Chichang, who now lives in Paris, but a so-called avant-garde artist. But again, going back to, he's modernized it to a great extent and working with, but again, working with ink and color on paper, and just making it look more contemporary, I suppose, than the more classical artists. And if you move to the next one, Andrew, I don't want to take too long on this, but here's Xu Ping again, this huge installation that he did, and very famous one, Book from the Sky, which he did 20 or 30 years ago. But again, it's, as you see, hand printed books with scrolls and letterpress and type and ink on paper. So again, it's all to do with literature, with books and calligraphy. And then we have maybe another example of something. And here again, Gubwenda, a famous calligrapher, sculptor, painter, avant-garde, I suppose, but also completely immersed in his studies in the 1980s in Chinese classical literature, classical art. And here you have a huge installation at the United Nations of Temple of Heaven, he calls it. But again, you see the calligraphy and the paper coming through. So all of these works, even in the full-blooded avant-garde, relate back to Chinese history in a very clear, self-confident and meaningful way. It's I think the Chinese want us to understand that the Chinese living artists want us to understand just how long and how great that civilization was, and that it can now give birth to work which is relevant for people in the world today, not just Chinese society, but for the world today. And here we have a few examples of contemporary calligraphy, which are Xu Ping. There's a work behind me here also in my office here, where the square word calligraphy, which is, I mean, these are so interesting because these are examples of his painting works with beautiful calligraphy, which for the Chinese, when he sees this from afar, will think, oh my God, there's some Chinese writing, but he can't understand it. And the Englishman or the American who approaches this calligraphy comes to it and thinks, oh my God, that's Chinese, I can't understand it. But in fact, he can, because it's written in English. And you can see, you can in some of these, you can read now, all of you, various words, if you're clever enough, that are in English, but it's written in Chinese. So here he's playing Xu Ping with the importance of calligraphy on the one hand for the Chinese, but it's not understandable by the Chinese. And similarly, the Western viewer thinks, oh God, I can't understand this either because it's Chinese, but in fact he can. So again, this is this tension between cultures and between societies, East and West, etc. And then we can move on to exactly. So this is Wong Ling, somebody who was a great classical calligrapher, very well known in China as a young man, teaching at Hangzhou University in the south of Shanghai. Very well known, renowned classical calligrapher who became more and more interested in adapting Chinese classical calligraphy into modern terms, modern aesthetic. And here you have a beautiful painting, which is inspired by calligraphy, but in fact it looks like a great abstract expressionist painting by Motherwell or somebody like that. And yet it comes obviously from a very different source. But you get an impression of the understanding of brushwork, of the value of ink for the Chinese. Don't forget that Chinese invented ink, they invented paper. And so we move on to another one there. Don't want to make it too fast, but because we want to leave time for questions. And here's another example of a woman calligrapher in Taiwan. Again, Lasting Happiness it's called, but again, working at this time on a gold background, which is again has a relationship to past gold ground paintings in the 17th and 18th century. And then, and here again, Gubwenda, again, here is calligraphy, but pseudo characters. Here you can't read, again, you can't read the characters, but he's that which makes it clear to people today that Chinese calligraphy contained meaning, but it also contained just aesthetic meaning, just beauty for the sake of beauty. And after all, the great population of China over 2,000 years was completely illiterate, but they responded to the beauty of the brush.
Michael, thank you. That's fascinating. Just going to hold the slides for the moment because I'd like to see if Martin would manage some questions for you, and then perhaps we can come back to the illustrations again later, if that's okay. So, Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rory. Thank you, Michael. You're a man who's very calm under pressure, obviously, and going live. We do have a very interesting question from Angelo. Perhaps I can ask on his behalf. So Angelo, and I quote, "Good morning to all and congratulations to Michael for his great competence. My impression is that Chinese collectors are more attracted by Western contemporary art or by Chinese contemporary art, much less involved in contemporary ink paintings. Could you kindly comment?"
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. The fact is that now, recently, in the last couple of years, it's been considered to be very chic, very cool by some of the young emerging multi-millionaires to buy Western art, of course. And I mean, and there's no doubt that that's happening, and it'll continue to happen. And it's a very interesting relationship. However, I think that the reality is that for the educated Chinese, there is no doubt, whether they're young and rich or not, that they will ultimately be interested in their own culture. It's true, for example, in America and Germany and Italy and England, etc., that the contemporary collectors tend to buy their own national artists. Not always the case, but it usually is the case. And with China, this growing self-confidence in China, this actually a growing nationalism now, unfortunately, in China, it's very likely, it's already happened to some extent, but it's very likely that some of the Chinese young will want to buy the contemporary expression of their great civilization. It's also happening to a great extent, actually, the new museum in Hong Kong is actively buying ink painting. There are private museums in China that are doing the same thing. Don't forget, there are 300 or 400 museums cropping up every month in China. 300 or 400 museums cropping up every month in China, all empty. So I think there's no doubt that from a cultural point of view, there will be a growing interest in the contemporary expression of Chinese history.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm glad to tell you that you're exciting quite a few compliments. If I could ask a question from Susie, and again, I'll just quote her entire question. Good morning. It's such an interesting and amazing talk. Michael mentioned that the ink artists in the past were usually well educated in all aspects and are mostly working as government officers. The contemporary artists today are relatively independent from government, or even going against the government. That's a question. Just wondering how this affects the subject and content of ink painting and calligraphy. So do you see that the question in that?
Right. Well, it's a lovely question as well. I mean, I think that again, we mustn't forget that the ink painting is being done by artists both in mainland China and in Taiwan and in Hong Kong and in Singapore to a lesser extent, and in Paris and New York and London and elsewhere, in Los Angeles, etc. So it's been done all over the place by Chinese artists of Chinese origin. And I think that they of course do not have any relationship at all to the government anymore. But the reason I mentioned the calligraphers of the past and the scholars of the past is because of this unique situation in China where the governing elite were scholars. I mean, I don't know of any other civilization which had that, and it's one of the most attractive features of Chinese civilization to me. But the contemporary ink artists are not involved with that at all. And they're not really affected, I don't think, by any sort of either domestic or long-term control by the Chinese government, nor are they particularly interested in politics. They're not, unlike much of contemporary art today, which is very politically orientated and involved. It's not really something that they're interested in. I think they're interested in art for art's sake, expressing in their works which find a way to mean something to a contemporary audience in the world, but nevertheless emerge out of and are proud of Chinese history and culture. That's not a completely direct answer to your question, but I can't do any better than that for the moment. I'm so sorry, but thank you for the question anyway.
I think it was a very nice answer, actually, and I hope Susie thinks so. We have a question from Tanya, if I may, and she's obviously interested in different aspects of Eastern and Western art. And if I may quote, Tanya, what are the main ways in which Eastern and Western art are different from each other, or do they overlap? Is it possible to replicate the styles and techniques of the old Chinese masters in the contemporary art made today in the West? Interesting question, I think, Michael.
Okay, so I think what is interesting is this, that the art in the West stems from a totally different mentality than art in the East. And it's a very complicated subject, but this is I think the main difference. Chinese art, calligraphy and painting, was not so much destined to make beautiful paintings, but to find a way for the artist to develop his own capacities as a human being, to become a scholar gentleman who would be esteemed for his caliber as a human being. In other words, art was a means to develop the inner life of human beings. And that is not something that was ever true in the West. So that, for me, I think is the fundamental difference. It comes from a very different perspective. Insofar as what's going on today, I think that there are artists in the West. There's a woman in Paris, there's somebody in Los Angeles who have been very attracted by Chinese contemporary art and Chinese contemporary ink painting in particular, who do try to emulate it in some way, who technically can be very proficient and are doing quite interesting work. I, however, have not invited these artists into my stable of artists, because fundamentally, I think they come at it from a Western perspective. It's very different, interested as they are in the whole evolution of Chinese contemporary ink painting, they come from a different perspective. And I'm really interested in the one I've been describing, the fundamentals that I've been describing.
Thank you very much. I will keep going. I'm sorry, we're making very good use of you, and you haven't had a break. But no. We do have several more questions, and obviously some people on the call are very interested in your views. Rebecca has asked, there seems to be a global interest in contemporary art that is more and more abstract. Do you think that this is also true within the presentation of calligraphy and ink wash techniques in contemporary interpretations of Chinese artworks?
Rebecca, actually, exactly. I think that's exactly one of the things that has been happening. I mean, again, it's a complicated subject. Calligraphy, classical calligraphy in the 8th century AD, in the Tang period, etc., was classical. It was abstract. This is abstract art at its peak. So it's always been abstract. But I think what's happened with the contemporary ink artists is that they're distorting. They felt it necessary to distort the classical Chinese characters in order to part company, if you like, with the traditional canon. And in this distortion, there is abstraction. And so to take the example that we've just looked at, Ling, who was a classical calligrapher, just doing beautiful characters, he has become much freer, much more abstract. And so in a way, it's so interesting that Chinese contemporary ink artists are still related to the Chinese canon, classical canon, but also beginning to be related to what has been very much more popular in the 20th century in Europe and in America, namely abstract expressionism in America, I should say first. So, so the answer is yes. It has become much more abstract. On the other hand, you take like a calligraphy behind me by Xu Ping, he is not going abstract. He's going purely back into the classical canon, but nevertheless making it different. And it's a little bit difficult to explain, but that's basically the best I can do on that question, Rebecca, but thank you for it.
Exceptional as a Westerner with your insight into the culture and history of Chinese art. It is exceptional. A question from Anthony. Does the tradition of artists being made to copy the old masters before being allowed to embark on their own still obtain?
Yeah, no, it does not actually, I don't think. Even the people like Liu Dan and Li Huayi that we looked at in the classical section there, who are absolutely outstanding technically as well as conceptually, they have not trained like artists until the 20th century were training in copying the old masters, both in calligraphy and in painting. By the way, that gives me the opportunity to just mention that, you know, Chinese art was declining. Again, it's a generalization in the 19th century and the 20th century rather substantially. And then when you had Mao coming in the communist interregnum from 1949, Chinese art completely deteriorated. Although Mao himself, interestingly enough, was a calligrapher and a very good one. Also a poet. Not such a good poet, but a very good calligrapher. And so he did respect calligraphy. But nevertheless, art declined substantially during that period. And it's really in the last 30 years, in the 80s, 90s, and now, the last 40 years, that you have this culture, what I now call a real cultural revolution happening in China. And it's thrilling. It's not happening anywhere else in the world, which is why I felt there is nothing to compare with it. The huge wealth in China, focusing on its own art, is likely to produce huge appreciation for works that are authentic. And when I use the word authentic, that again leads me to another point, and then I'll make this as quick as possible because we've got other questions, that so much of the antiquities in China, so much of the antique world in China is now overshadowed by the fact that there are many fakes, brilliant fakes in jade, in ceramics, etc. So that it means that it's very, they're so good that many experts can't even discern what is authentic from what is fake. And that has cast a whole cloud over the whole area of antique collecting in China. Whereas contemporary art, of course, whether it's ink or not, doesn't have that problem, which is why another reason why I believe there's a huge upside on the Chinese contemporary art, in particular Chinese ink painting.
Thank you very much, Michael. Actually, if you don't mind, we're going to keep pressing your deep knowledge because there are more and more questions. I think from Nandini, and I quote, "It is an inspiring talk indeed. How are male and female Chinese artists differing in their concepts of abstraction inside their paintings or inking?"
Gosh, you know, I don't really know. I think that the fact is that there are fewer women artists than male artists working in Chinese ink painting. However, the first artist I ever came across, Yang Ping, who I came across in the late 1980s and who's become a very close friend and was the first person I ever represented, is a woman. She's now 85, still painting, and became very prominent, very much collected in the West by Western museums. Grace Tong Yongtse, the calligrapher, we saw an image of hers a few minutes ago, very famous calligrapher in Taiwan. So there are quite a lot of very, very good Chinese ink artists who are women, but it is still a minority. And I don't think, to answer the question, that there's a great difference, if any, in the, interestingly enough, but I would have to study it more. Now, I haven't thought about it enough, whether there's really any great difference in perspective or optic in terms of the difference between men and women. It's a very interesting subject.
It's an interesting question. Could I go back to Anthony? Anthony, I think, obviously has visited China a great deal and has some insight as well. And I quote, "In the late 1980s, I visited an artist colony in Chongqing. It was a large building with a number of large and comfortable flats for the artists, with studios below and a wonderful view of the river. All was provided by the government. Works of art were sold in the gallery, and I believe the proceeds were shared by all. How has the situation changed since then?" So I don't think Anthony is referring just to that artist colony in Chongqing, but is there anything you could say more broadly?
No, well, I think that more broadly, I think that artists that are subsidized by the government tend not to be the artists doing really creative work, is one point. But what was interesting is, you know, when I first went to China in the 1989, I think it was 1990, just and went to see artists, they were all living in very, very humble circumstances, really in the traditional garrets. And it was a delight to work with them and to get to know them and so forth. Now, Chinese contemporary artists are flourishing financially and are living in sort of concrete contemporary architecture, not always the most beautiful. And they've really done extremely well. So it's a different world today. And they do, you know, they're much more appreciated than they were. However, I still think that the Chinese art market is in an embryonic state. It's still fragmented. It's still not fully developed. It's not professional. Not very professional. And I think that there again, there's a huge potential for things to improve in China and for artists to be identified as serious or not serious, etc. There's an enormous amount of work being done in China still by ink artists who have no interest whatsoever. Beautiful paintings of trees and of flowers and of mountains, which have no contemporary interest at all, apart from being beautifully decorative. I'm only interested in artists who are doing creative work, breaking new ground. And there's only about 25 or 30 of them in the whole of China.
In that regard, if I may just give you a comment from Jennifer, who said, and I quote, "This is a wonderful talk. I do appreciate hearing your expert overview with pointers for works new to me to study." There's no question, but I just wanted to give you that point, which is very kind of Jennifer to say that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And with that, Roddy, could I hand back to you?
Yes, of course. Michael, thank you. Absolutely fascinating. Martin, thanks for doing that. Michael, I'm just wondering whether there are a few more slides you could share with us for, say, 5 minutes before we close, if that's possible, and Andrew can do that with you.
With pleasure, Andrew. Let's, where did we get? Well, here you see as an example, Wei Ligang, who is a Chinese contemporary calligrapher in Beijing. And this is a very interesting example of what I was trying to talk about before, where there is a clear reference, you see, to Chinese classical characters, right? I can't point at it from here, but each one, there's a classical character there in each, 3 at the top, 3 after that. And so, however, he's distorted them. And he's distorted them in different ways. There's hints of representation, of figures, of birds, of houses, etc. He's also broken them up in certain ways to make them more abstract. So what he's doing here very deliberately 10 years ago is, and he was doing this earlier as well, and because he also was a great classical art calligrapher, is to find a way to make Chinese calligraphy, which was so important for the Chinese society going back for thousands of years, make it relevant to the modern world in some way, find a way. Is it through abstraction? Is it through integrating pictorial, representational elements? Trying to find a way forward. So that's a good example of just that. And he also has become much freer. Much of his work now is completely abstract, unleashing the Chinese line completely. Well, we don't have an example of that here, unfortunately, but this gives a good example of what I was trying to talk about. Andrew, can you move on to another one? To another area of, let's see, what composite, here we are. Right, so this is a lovely, I love this painting and I love this artist who, again, I mean, he comes from the northwest part of China, and where there were a huge amount of different languages, and he then went to Berlin and studied there, then he went to Boston. And here, again, this is abstract, this is calligraphy, this is Chinese painting, brush painting on paper, which he makes himself, by the way, this paper, to absorb the ink in certain ways, but it's become completely abstract. And so this is a good example of how some ink painters have just completely become abstract, but it's not, but it comes from a different source, a different mindset than people like Robert Motherwell and Franz Klein and so forth, the abstract expressionist painters in the 60s, 50s and 60s in America. And Andrew, we can have a look at another. These are just wonderful to look at, these beautiful paintings. Thank you, Roddy. This is a very large painting by Chodeshu, who was a Red Guard. I mean, this is a very, he had a tragic life. Chodeshu became a very good friend of mine, still alive in his late 70s. And he became a Red Guard during the Mao period. And in fact, witnessed things during his time which broke him completely psychologically. And when he came out of that period, he was a broken man. And since then, he then started one of the first two avant-garde movements in China in 1979, 1980, and became avant-garde, so-called avant-garde in those days, and broke completely new ground. And became also was in Shanghai and became very influential. And this is a huge painting which again goes back to Chinese classical landscape painting, but here he's using ink and acrylic in this case on Xuan paper, on paper and canvas, laid down on canvas. And it's again, it evokes the whole atmosphere of Chinese traditional painting, but in in wonderful new modern abstract, semi-abstract terms. Just a wonderful, wonderful work by a wonderful artist. And gosh, this is by Ching, who is in Taiwan, a great scholar, one of the most famous poets in Chinese in the world, a poet who's been translated in 40 languages. His name was put forward 20 years ago for the Nobel Prize because of his gifts for literature. He's studied Shakespeare, has written about T.S. Eliot. In other words, a deeply cultivated scholar in the old style of scholar. And here he is imitating art. I mean, this is a subject where he breaks up the composition. So you've got a mountain, which is actually a mountain, but which is actually transparent, and you can see the sea behind it. You see a road and a tree, and then the sunset and so forth. And he's creating in this, the composition is very colorful, very restructuring space. And again with references to the past, but making it very contemporary and relevant to the future, introducing contemporary elements like aeroplanes and cars, etc. And he's one of the most interesting contemporary artists working today, but from Taiwan, has a studio also in Shanghai. And here's actually another Taiwanese artist, very beautiful painting, who works with gold leaf and ink as well as paper. And he's probably one of the most famous artists in Taiwan. And again, deeply influenced by the original landscape paintings, but using colors which would never have been accepted in China in the past. And although there's something blocking the bridge at the bottom, but on the bridge at the bottom, he's painted himself as artists did in the classical period. Figures were always tiny, and the mountains were always towering above them. The idea being that we, human beings, are so insignificant in nature and in terms of the universe and in terms of historical evolution and cycles. And there he is with his girlfriend at the time, I think it was. No, actually it's more recent. It's his wife who emerges very often in his paintings, see crossing the bridge there. But again, look at the color and the gold leaf and this wonderful rhythms, abstract rhythms, but again, in this case, representational, more or less representational of a notional landscape. I don't know whether we have another painting, Andrew, there in this group. Right, so this is Lee Chevalier, another fascinating artist who is Chinese origin. She became a singer with the National Operatic Company, the military company. So she became quite famous in China. She was a musician and a philosopher. She then married a Frenchman, a diplomat in the 1980s. She moved to Paris. And what she's doing, a fascinating woman, is working with ink and mixed media, which is grit and sand and natural ingredients on canvas. So one of the few ink artists to work on canvas. And it's, of course, much tougher to work on canvas than it is on ink, because the canvas arrests the flow of ink. And she's trying, therefore, in her case, to find a way to create a connection between Western art, which is work oil on canvas, and Eastern art, which is much more fluid, which is ink on paper. And she's trying to create the idea of ink and the flow of ink in symbolizing the mentality of the Chinese historically, which is much more fluid, against the mentality of the West, which is much more concrete. Again, these are words which are rather difficult to cram into an explanation. But the net result is these very interesting works of hers, which are very beautiful, but also contain a real message, an aesthetic message. Is there another one, Andrew? Anything else we haven't seen? We haven't got so many. Yes, we can go through. We can just pop through again and have a look. And if there's anything else I've left out, just move on so that viewers, the audience has a chance to see some of the paintings again. If you can just move on, Andrew, from that one and then the next one. It gives you an overview of the different types of Chinese ink painting that exist at the moment.
Michael, who is the artist who was influenced a lot by Scotland and did scenes that were of Scotland?
Right. So that was the one we've just seen, the green landscapes. Yeah, so thank you, Rodney. That's a really good point. And he actually had an epiphany in Scotland, because he went to Scotland about 15 years ago and found an affinity between his own landscapes in Taiwan and the mountainscapes in Scotland. And for him, it was very important. And then he went back to Taiwan, and he's now painting in the style that you've just seen, this very beautiful green mountainscape. He also, by the way, is a photographer and an installation artist, etc. So he also does work which is more ostentatiously avant-garde, if you like. But I think that his ink paintings contain this imagination, this audacity, this determination to break away from the past and yet remain linked to it.
Lovely. Good.
You know, for me, it's the pleasure of dealing with the Chinese contemporary art is that it's some of the most creative work being done in the world today. And it's being done in the context of an emerging power, with all the ramifications that means for us in the world going forward, you know. And for me, it's a way to gain access to the Chinese thinking, Chinese thought, and above all, the Chinese reverence for the Chinese history, this great empire, and for the education. And look at the Chinese, you know this from America. I mean, look at who are emerging at the top of every class at Harvard and Princeton and Stanford, etc. Is Chinese.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Martin, could you like to say a few words and then I'll close and thank Michael?
Yes, thank you very much. Firstly, to all of the audience for joining today. We had a lot of registrations, and we still have almost 80 people stayed on all the way through. I think we had a couple of students at the start, Michael, who had some interesting performance art, but it's not for this venue. And thank you very much for continuing through and talking so fluidly with such intelligence and such insight, and bringing it back, I think, at the end to an understanding of why anyone would study contemporary Chinese art, which is to understand China, which obviously is what part of what Roddy's started with the Asia Scotland Institute, and a greater understanding of Asia through various aspects of the study of Asia. So thank you very much. I greatly appreciate your time and your patience and your intelligence today. And Roddy, over to you, please.
Michael, thank you, bless you. Thank you for that fascinating talk. I know some of the people that were watching were wondering where they could get a hold of or see examples of the works that you talked about. And we can, of course, direct them to your website, and you do put out, don't you, often videos yourself. So if you would like us to share those with people who've been on this call, we'd be very grateful. But
Roddy,
I'm particularly grateful to you.
With pleasure.
Good. Well, I'm particularly grateful to you for enlightening us. Yeah.
And thank you, all of you, for giving me a fantastic opportunity to do the talk and be in touch with many of you, the audience. And I think that what you're doing actually is exactly what interests me, which is trying to find a way to encourage people in the West to get to grips with Asia in particular, and Asia in general, and China in particular, because it's so important.
Good. Well, Michael, thank you. Thank you. It's been a fascinating hour, and good. And we've had some art student interruptions, which are always fun to have. And you kept going as Martin said. So thank you very much on behalf of everybody on this call and the Asia Scotland Institute for your very, very interesting talk.
Thank you, Roddy, and thank you, Martin, so much. And thank you, Andrew. It's been lovely to be here. Thank you. God bless you all. Have a wonderful